Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, July 16th, 2025, episode 439, and we're going to talk about good racism. Um, right. Race theory was my big thing in my graduate work, the centerpiece of my graduate work. And then what I pretty much focused on once I got my doctorate. And when I would teach race, every once in a while, I would get a question uh, regarding racism, which is there such thing as a good racism? And I said, yeah, of course there is. As we don't call it racism, we use different words for it. And I've recently been using the um, racialization of good parenting as an example of good racism. In other words, when we generalize and then stereotype people in a certain way, but it's positive, then we don't call it racism, right? We say it's something good, but we rarely will identify certain positive behaviors, what society would consider positive behaviors, as racism, which is a word that we generally will use for negative situations. All right, so let's take a step back. If you haven't gone back and listened to the very beginning of this podcast channel, then you know, and which is totally understandable, but I guess which is why I'm doing this kind of a review, catch up, sort of this is what I do on this channel type episode. So everything is subjective, I've said, and uh, obviously I'm the subjective professor, and I take this approach because of my training in postmodernist discourse. And some people will roll their eyes when they say that, but I really try to understand postmodernism. And as I've said before, it very much is similar to my theological training. So where I went to seminary, they emphasize this idea of examining assumptions. And those assumptions become your starting point. Okay. So postmodernism is very much similar in that all it is really doing is revealing the subject or the origin of information. So all information comes to us through a person who's looking at the world and then telling us their observations. It's not the truth. It's not absolute. It is one person's subjectivity, right? Subjective perspective. And so when we take information, when we receive information, generally it's presented to us in the form of facts, right? This is knowledge, right? And so we don't question where this information come from. I used to joke around in class. I would basically ask science students, when you're required to go buy a textbook, do you go see the bookstore manager and ask about the academic training and background of the authors of this textbook? And of course, no one ever does because you would just assume that all of the information in that book is going to be true. We do this, sort of out of habit. And the only time we question it is when we don't like the arguments that are made in the book. We just say, I don't like this book. And then it no longer becomes legitimate, valid, or a good source of information because we don't like the subjectivity. And that's really what the problem is. You don't like the assumptions and therefore the conclusions that are being made from that subjective perspective. I hope I didn't lose anyone, but basically what we're saying is if you have a different subjective perspective, if you have a different perspective, then you're generally not going to see the same things as someone else, and so you're going to make different conclusions. Each individual, each person has a different subjective view. By going to school, by having friends, by talking to people, by having life experiences, you are going to find people who have similar, in certain situations, similar opinions, similar perspectives, but only on very narrow subjects. Okay. So postmodernism itself is not a source of truth. You don't get to the truth. All postmodernism does is reveals the subjective perspective. Where is this information coming from? And so at the end of the day, after you figure out where the information is coming from, what perspective is being used to create this information, now you have to decide what you're going to do. You have to decide what information is more reliable than something else. All it does is reveal subjectivity or perspective. And that's why this channel is called Subjective Professor, because that's pretty much what I do. My debate style, if you will, is not to make a conclusion, not to even tell people that they're wrong, but rather to say that one perspective is not as productive as another one, that even if it is not as productive, you may prefer that. And so it's perfectly fine for you to take that subjectivity, make those choices based on that subjectivity, but the cost and all of the consequences of your actions, those belong to you because it's your subjectivity, it's your choice, right? And that's why I've said before, freedom comes with responsibility. So you exercise your freedom by using your perspective. I'm right, you're wrong, so I'm going to do it this way. So whatever happens, that's on you, okay? So all I try to do is figure out where there are more subjectivities. And as soon as you find another subjective perspective or another way of looking at things, then you undermine the absolute truth nature of something else someone else wants to claim is the absolute fact. Right. And so I've said before in other episodes, I would play this quote unquote game with students. I would say there's no truth. There's all facts are subjective. And I had one student who wouldn't let it go. He sent me emails and we did this thing for weeks where he would try to find a piece of information that was absolutely true. And it's so easy to undermine the truth content of any so-called fact because all you have to do is change the standards. You have to just simply change the language, change the time period, change the context. So, for example, one example he gave me was Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania, right? That's what he was. That's a fact. And I was like, yeah, but 300 years ago it wasn't, right? And so absolute means that forever and ever it will always be true. And who's to say that 300 years from now there's still a Pennsylvania? Seeing as how things are moving now towards a nuclear Armageddon, maybe there won't be a Harrisburg. And so Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania will cease being a meaningful statement to people. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from. You might be saying, well, that's just word games. Well, yeah, maybe, but then all of the assertions for truth are also basically war games. And so we're right back to the beginning, where it's each individual's choice what to believe and how they're going to live their life. And that pretty much is how I constructed class. And everyone realized that I'm not going to tell them how they're going to live their life. They just need to make a choice. Okay. And so I always say, so this whole postmodernist exercise is supposed to be advantageous, right? So the postmodernists themselves, like Derrida and all those guys, they screwed up because they stopped doing research once they found a subjectivity that they liked. And then they started teaching everyone that subjectivity. Well, there are other subjectivities. And whenever you encounter a problem, an obstacle, a hurdle, a barrier, whatever, all you have to do is shift subjectivity, and then you can resolve that obstacle. And that's what I was more concerned about: how to move life forward, how to keep growing in your life, not to encounter a problem and then get depressed and, give up or whatever, but rather know how to keep the ball moving forward. And this is great because it fits in well with my Christian worldview, which basically maintains and assumes that all of us are largely ignorant and life is about learning everything whenever, especially when needed. So we are living lives to discover more information. And the moment you make the assertion that you know everything you need to know, well, now you're being arrogant. You are cutting yourself off from new information. You're being conservative. And so that's where the problems begin. This might be a little bit longer episode than other episodes, primarily because this topic is so huge, but I'll try to move faster. So one area of subjectivity is the perception of race. So remember, the lawyer of the university asked me, "Are you aware people call you a racist?" Well, yeah. So depending on how you're using that word, that's important, but think about the word is essentially empty to call someone a racist because all of us are racist, right? We all discriminate. We all will make distinction of one person from another. So if you're constantly going up to everyone and saying, you all look the same to me, right? Only I look different. Well, then, okay, congratulations. You are not discriminating, but then you are because you're discriminating yourself from everybody else. So to make a distinction, one person from another, that is to discriminate. That is what we generally will understand is racism. We all do it. We have preferred things and things that we don't prefer. So what? Right? It's not a big deal, but because of all the knowledge production, the scholarship that university professors are pumping out these days, now all of a sudden it's a dirty word. Now all of a sudden it's a bad thing. But otherwise, we do it all the time, right? And so to call someone a racist is not a big deal because all of us are. So let's go back to the definition. I've said this several times of late, but race is just a generalization. That's it. It's a generalization. It's a starting point of learning. But within each generalization are specifics, right? And so if we're talking about inanimate objects, then we're saying, oh, well, in this situation, you got to do like this because it's a different, right? And so once you have this broad generalization, now you dig down into specifics. And the more specifics that you know, the more people will call you an expert. If we're talking about people, well, the specifics are individuals, right? So the generalization of people within the specifics within that generalization are individuals. And you will have as many specifics as you have individuals in any given category, right? And so if there are 100 people that are identified as Asians, well, you have 100 specific individuals, okay, that can occupy one generalization. You need both, right? You can't say, oh, let's get rid of stereotypes, let's get rid of race. No, no, you need generalizations. And once you realize that race is a generalization, it clears up so much confusion with everything else. I saw it popped up on my news feed. It probably was because I've been talking about it lately. And so on my news feed, it talked about this was the title, How Intelligence Leads to Stereotyping. A new study complicates the trope of the stupid bigot, right? So stupid bigot, excuse me, bigot, the stereotype of a bigot is that they're stupid, right? And so then a study came out that showed that uh, bigotry is basically stereotyping, right? And therefore, smart people will do this stereotyping, right? Just to give you a line from that, I looked it up, I read the article, and it turned out to be from 2017. So, new study, it's 8 years old already, but that's also around the time that I wrote my book on race as well. But anyway, here's a couple lines from that article. Racists stereotype other people for the most part, but there are also stereotypes about racists. And the stereotype about racists is that, well, they're kind of dumb. But a new study complicates the narrative that only unintelligent people are prejudiced. The paper published recently in the Journal of Experimental Psychology suggests smart people are actually more at risk of stereotyping others. The study consists of a series of experiments, all of which suggest that people who performed better on a test of pattern detection, okay, a measure of cognitive ability, were also quicker to form and apply stereotypes. Higher cognitive abilities linked to greater risk of stereotyping. This is from NYU, also from 2017. That was the original study that the Atlantic writer, the writer from the Atlantic, was talking about. And all the study is talking about is pattern detection, aka generalization. So What we're saying is that stereotyping is pattern detection. Now, are you going to say that certain pattern detections are racist? It's kind of funny, isn't it? Right. And so that's what I'm trying to say. There is a very, very intimate link between what people would consider racism and comedy, right? Because once you realize that within certain generalizations, you'll have a very different group of specifics. And to call them all the same creates the comedy. Recently, I had an episode 269 about Leonarda Joni. She calls herself the most canceled female comedian. But, you know, she's funny, okay? And she goes and talks about topics that other people generally will opt not to because they don't want to be called a racist. But all she does is recognize patterns and talks about patterns. And for some people, it's funny. And then other people who are offended, they're offended either because they are part of the generalization and they don't like the stereotype that is being applied to them, or they're the exception to the stereotype, whatever. But it's funny. And so I wrote an article. It's called All Humor is Racist. That's pretty funny. Okay. You can find it on Libertarian Christian Institute. And it's a kind of a interesting reality that pattern detection is just simply generalization. Oh, okay. So once you realize that stereotyping is just simply a form of generalization, which if we express that technically, it's racism, or what I call racialization, creating a racial category. Okay. Well, then it's not a big deal. Okay. It's not a big deal. And it within that, there's good stereotyping and bad stereotyping. In other words, stereotype is a stereotype. What makes a stereotype a bad stereotype? When you write a law using that generalization. Okay. And the good example of racialization or racism is when you use it to your advantage. I've talked about the movie Hidden Figures before, right? The people in the movie were being discriminated because they were black, but they used their math ability to overcome the discrimination, right? And so you shift the perspective. You don't let people see you as a black person. You force people to see you as a mathematician, right? And so you shift perspective. And this is how we overcome discrimination, bad discrimination, right? So you've been criminalized or excluded simply because of your skin color, but you make it your math ability so precious and so expensive for them to ignore that they welcome you in. And this is how you break the color barrier, right? So Jackie Robinson, who played baseball, professional baseball before the civil rights movement, demonstrated that ignoring his baseball ability would be too costly. And so they had to bring him on. Everything else comes as a result. And eventually more and more of society lets go of their previous existing stereotypes. But you need to have it, right? This is part of the problem. And the only reason why a lot of these structures, the color barriers, took so long to come down is because legislation was made. Once legislation passes, then you have huge groups of people who benefit from the existence of that legislation. They fight, they resist, change. And so they try to preserve the law instead of allowing for the change, right? And hopefully that brings a little bit more clarity to, the problems of good and bad racism. But let's apply this idea of generalization specific to other topics like tribalism. Oh, tribalism. So people will talk about tribalism as if it's a bad thing. What is tribalism? Well, it's self-segregation, isn't it? Right? So you are going to say, well, I like to be around people like myself. Okay. That's self-segregation. I prefer them. I will defer to them. I will hang out with them. I'll give them more employment, right? Because I get along with them better, easier communication, shared culture, same holidays. So we don't have to have different days off. self-segregation. As long as it is voluntary, which is implied in self-segregation, what's the big deal? That's the way I want to go. To say that tribalism is bad, right? I go to a black church in an inner city and say, "Oh, you guys are practicing tribalism. Why are you all black at this church? Try that. I dare you." Okay. But it's not a big deal because that is what they prefer. And a lot of people, the way I practice Christianity, I would be uncomfortable in a black church, not because of the Jesus, but because of the way that they are going to practice their belief in Jesus, right? So the concept of melting pot as a opposition to tribalism. Well, is melting pot any better, right? When you all melt together, what's your new identity, right? Who gets to decide what that new identity looks like? And I was hinting at that yesterday. So is there an ideal? What generalization? Which behaviors are acceptable and which are not? Which behaviors, if you continue to practice them, means that oh, nope, you haven't melted enough. It's just so arbitrary. And so then let's look at Christian nationalism. Well, Christian nationalism, I talked about this yesterday. What's nationalism? What's Christian? I mean, what's American? One of my favorite comics is this guy, Henry Cho. And so if you thought I was Henry Cho, actually, Henry Cho has a really thick Southern drawl. Uh, and, he is an American. So what is an American? He doesn't look American until he opens his mouth. You're like, oh, he's an Asian. So what is American? Where is that conformity line? And as since we're on the topic, what about the first generation? Are first generation never American? Well, that's ridiculous, right? And then you have the problem of, at least in the Asian circles, this idea of K-pop, right? When I was growing up, in America, people took a dump on you because you were Korean, right? They're like, "What's Korean now? Yeah, whatever. You take your shoes off in your house. Ew, what's that smell?" All this stuff, right? And so you hated people seeing you as Korean. And then all of a sudden, K-pop, K-dramas, people started watching it. And I had students, literally, I had students come up to me who took my class only because I was Korean. They didn't care what I was teaching. They just wanted to be around a Korean, right? And then they told me how they were going to go. They had all these plans to study in Korea. And I'm like, why would you want to do that? Right? It was so bizarre that all of a sudden Asian culture, Asian people became popular. It was the most bizarre thing ever. And when I was growing up, I didn't want to learn Korean language. I didn't, you know, and a lot of kids hated their parents for forcing them to learn Korean. And with the K-pop generation, they started learning Korean on their own. They spoke better Korean than I ever did. And they were born here as well, and they'd never been to Korea. So it's kind of interesting. So this whole identity, this whole idea of nationalism, of identity, it's more complex than people want to discuss because it's a generalization. And as I said, within each generalization, when you're talking about people, each person is going to be unique. There is no generalization, right? Which will describe everyone in such a way where everyone will now behave in exactly the same way. It's impossible. I've tried, okay? Also, then you can talk about borders, right? And there was a whole discourse on borders. Borders are arbitrary, especially if you go to Africa. The European colonial powers just drew lines on the paper and said, okay, now you're in this country, you're in that country. And those borders went over tribal lines. And so you had part of one tribe in one country, part of the tribe in another country, now in the same country as one of their adversarial tribes, and now they're supposed to somehow get along together. The Europeans created such a mess in in Africa, but they tried to artificially create this nationalistic identity and it failed, right? And that's what I'm trying to say. So you try to think about nationalism here or melting pot to a national identity here in the United States, it's going to fail, right? Because everyone has different things that they care about. What we want is free interaction of people to lead to better ideas, right? And we are going to voluntarily associate with the people that we prefer. The more open we are, the more that we are exposed to more ideas, and we can figure out and discover which of our ideas are not as good as others. Okay. But remember, each of us, we don't inhabit one racialization. We don't inhabit one racial category, or one generalization. We have infinite, right? And we choose the one that is most important for us at that moment. If I'm at school, I'm going to talk about when I was, let's just say, when I was a seventh grader, then I'm going to self-identify as a seventh grader who's a dude, who's Asian, who goes to this high school, blah, blah, blah. And so we have many different racializations, and we pick and choose which ones are significant depending on where we are. Now, a situation that was discussed in that podcast I talked about yesterday, where liberals come into a conservative community. Okay. So there, the interaction, who gets to dictate the way things go? Well, who has the political power to write regulations and code and living standards in that neighborhood? And this is the politicization or the legislation of morality. So whoever has the upper hand, they are the ones who are going to dictate behavior codes. And this is what's wrong. This is why communities uh, become more politicized than they are about community, right? Because if you get the political power, you're going to control my life. And it creates the animosity, it creates all of the tension and people doubling down on what they believe is right and wrong. And so there's no longer this discourse and exchange of ideas. Now it's just empty morality being shoved in each other's faces. It never ends well. Uh, ethno-nationalism, right? So nationalism based on some kind of ethnic identity. Look, you never want to codify anything, right? Codifying any kind of nationalistic mindset, whether it's according to ethnic belief or religious belief, it doesn't matter. It always leads to war and violence. You hate other people. If you watched Joyeux Noel, which it's the French, if you say Merry Christmas in French, that's what it is, right? There's a movie and it's about World War I, about the Christmas peace. I've talked about it numerous times. The beginning of the movie begins with in the beginning of the movie, all the little kids have to memorize a poem which teaches hate about other countries. That's all it is. And so once you socialize kids to hate, yeah, you close all of the communication roads, right? You become closed-minded, you become insular. It happens through legislation, right? And this is why I am anti-government in principle, because all they do is they try to standardize things, and eventually they get around to morality, behavior codes, and beliefs itself. So the starting point is right here where we are right now. We start from here and we try to roll back the state. And as I said yesterday, the goal is freedom. It's nothing concrete. I forget who said it. I was listening to someone today. They generally start with a goal and then they backfill what they need to believe or have in order to get there, right? I'm saying we don't know where we end up. We do not know what the world is going to look like in the future because we're going to be free. And all of us who are free, we're going to interact with each other, respond with each other. One person does something, I was planning on doing this, but what they did looks better. I'm going to change my mind. And so all of these, you do not know what will happen. And that's why life is about anticipation, right? So you might have some sort of expectation, but you don't know where that road is going to take you. You don't know what's on the other at the end of that road, and you don't know what you're going to encounter while you're on that road, which will take you someplace else. The key is that we do not know what tomorrow will bring. And if we say, no, 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 it has to go this way, well, now you're acting like a government. Okay. Look, as we grow in our lives, we are going to add racializations to ourselves. Racializations that I didn't even know existed when I was a kid, that's going to become part of me. Look, podcaster, when I was 20, No, if you said podcaster, no one knows what you're talking about. There was no such thing as YouTube back then, streaming. Video games when I was a kid, totally different from what video games are today. So as we move ahead, as long as we live in a free, dynamic society, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what to expect. But what you do know is that bad ideas fall by the wayside. In a free society, what is bad, what is costly and expensive becomes unpopular. And this is fine because generally the good ideas, and I'm talking a good ideas in a free society, those are generally productive and they are so desirable that they will persuade a lot of people who are trying to hold on to bad traditions, bad racializations, they will give them up in exchange for a better way of living life. That's what it's all about, right? So, what's good racism in a world of bad racism? Bad racism is codified thought, standardized thought, a absolute goal that you have with your ignorant mind and saying, we're going to get there because it's going to be great for everybody. No, good racism is each individual discriminating according to their own personal benefit. And each, you might call it self-interest, right? If we use free market terminology. And so you're going to discriminate according to your own self-interest. All of us doing this all at the same time, interacting, seeing what other people are doing, will take us and our society to a better place. And that is why this is the Subjective Professor podcast, right? Because it's recognizing the subjectivity that we don't get caught being conservative about the wrong things. Hope that all that made sense. I was a little bit long, but hope it was worth it. And I'll talk to you next time.